Interesting. We have 7 principles that are values that we affirm here, and I'll talk more about them later in the service. And there's an idea about adding an 8th principle. And I want to tell you what it is. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So what you're going to hear today from our members of our social justice community, their feelings about, anti-racism, anti-oppression, about working toward this 8th principle.
Our chalice lighting words are adapted from the Unitarian Universalist Association Journey Towards Wholeness website. To walk the path of the journey towards wholeness is to heal the brokenness in our nation, in our faith community, and in our individual hearts. The work of anti-racism and anti-oppression is spiritual work. The term journey towards wholeness expresses the spiritual nature of the work and a recognition that there is brokenness caused by racism. The path begins internally. We take a fresh look at ourselves and learn to identify our personal and institutional relationship to oppressive systems. We learn skills to help dismantle racism in our institution. At the same time that we work to get our own house in order, we move into authentic, multiracial, multicultural, and interfaith coalitions for effective, spiritually driven action for justice. We take steps along this path to begin to understand racism and oppression, individual, cultural, and institution. I invite all of you to join me on this journey.
Hello, I'm here to give a little talk on Decentering Whiteness, our book study group, and how I consider it a spiritual practice. From what I've learned in the discussions that we have about the 8th principle, it would expand the freedoms of indigenous people and people of color to further dismantle racism and oppression from white supremacy groups. And this dismantling should be a goal of faith denominations. Unifying the 8th principle becomes a unifying part of our Unitarian Universalist journey. The book that we use in our book study right now, this time around, is How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. I want to read just really a brief part of this book to further explain that there are still movements in this century to try to remove slavery and the principle of thought. As a historian Patrick Royale writes, law did not merely reflect popular attitudes, it also reinforced them, leading a new explanatory power to race. It was becoming unnecessary to argue why black people were inferior. Blackness itself was becoming sufficient cause for assuming inferiority. Black abolitionists spoke out against both slavery in the South and the virulent racism that existed in their own ranks. They understood that a successful abolition movement could not simply be anti-slavery, but had to also be founded on principles of anti-racism. So this is how I feel that adding the 8th principle would be a help to those that are still in the movement of abolition. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm a short stuff, so I had to adjust the bench. Can you hear me well? Good morning. I want to share our humanist series on colonialism and what I learned from that, because it helped me discern the root injustices underlying the need for an eighth principle. So 2 of our guest speakers in the humanist series identified a dangerous system of divide and rule based on race, ethnicity, and religion. It was a system put in place to facilitate the accumulation of wealth for elites across continents over more than 6 centuries. Since World War II, this system continues to be dusted off and used by neo-colonial countries such as ours. Our first guest speaker, Sima Abrahamian, spoke of how religious sectarianism is still utilized in the former Ottoman Empire to divide and rule. In Lebanon, for example, where my ex-husband is from, where we spent 10 summers, for example, the stage is preset for a drama of Christian and Muslim sects to battle each other in parliament, literally leaving no time to address the pressing problems of delivering food, sanitation, and electricity to the population, or dealing with disasters like the Beirut port explosion that we all heard of recently. So this is not a faraway problem. If you visit some of the local churches, like Our Lady of Lebanon on Coral Way, which is a Maronite Catholic church, or St. Jude in Brickell, which is a Malachite Catholic, or St. George's Antiochian, which is Orthodox. If you chat with some of the parents at our French-American school here on campus, you will discover how alive this sectarianism still is. Continuing on the topic of divide and rule in the former Ottoman Empire, Dr. Abrahamian brought our attention to our recent exit from Afghanistan. When the reins of power were handed over to Turkey, we civilians may not be aware that Turkey still operates under a notion of neo-Ottomanism and pan-Islamism. This is the notion that only Turkic peoples belong in territories stretching all the way from the Balkans to Central Asia. It's an idea that has led Turkey to repress non-Islamic and non-Turkic minorities, like the Kurds and the Armenians. If you come in contact with the Afghan or Syrian refugees in our network of social justice groups, you will no doubt hear of how they have been directly affected by this neo-Ottoman version of divide and rule. Closer to home, our second guest, Dr. Jean-Élissin Saint-Ville, spoke of the recent influx of Haitian refugees into Texas and their brutal treatment by mounted guards wielding whips. A shout out here to Nikki Lindquist, who's actually off celebrating her birthday, couldn't be here. She's been keeping us UU members plugged into developments in Haiti, so I thank her for that. Anyway, our Haitian speaker grappled with how Haiti, the first country to be governed by former black slaves, whose first constitution in 1805 guaranteed religious freedom and abolished slavery, whose motto is tout monde c'est monde, meaning every person is a person. How could such a proud country be forced to twice oust a democratically elected president, whose only crime was to increase the minimum wage, make university education widely accessible, and infuse funds into national health care? It's not just the unrelenting series of hurricanes that caused Haitians to flee their beautiful island, but rather white supremacist leaders from our own country and from the French-speaking world who blocked Haiti's self-determination. They reinstituted a divide and rule policy by handing political power back to the mulattoes, economic power back to a dozen white families, many of them living outside of the island, and placing bona fide criminals at the head of government. This has wreaked more insidious havoc on the country than hurricanes ever could. Dr. Saint-Ville's quick survey of Haitian history gave us a clear understanding of how a race-based hierarchy was set up by colonial France to control its 99% African origin population, where only whites were considered to be full human beings, whilst half-black mulattoes and quarter-black Quaterons were deemed lesser and the slaves not human at all. But economically, Haiti was more prosperous than all the other 15 colonies in the Americas. But this came at a price. Its enslaved laborers were literally worked to death, so much so that after 7 years they would perish and be replaced by a whole new influx of kidnapped workers from various French African countries like Benin, the Ivory Coast, etc. So we in the New World, in turn, benefited from West Africa's brain drain. Finally, as we contemplate the eighth principle, we must begin by acknowledging that here, our whitewashed demography has been the result of both the genocide of native peoples and of race-based immigration policies, which clearly privileged white Christians from Northern and Western Europe. Only our thirst for labor has nudged open our doors to other immigrants from the world majority. Going forward, how can we learn from the insights provided by our humanist guest speakers on the Middle East and Haiti? How can we become better allies to our fellow human beings in regions especially where our country has been directly involved as a neo-colonial force? I believe that our spiritual growth in an increasingly globalized world depends not only on cultivating international solidarity through people-to-people alliances, as our sixth principle suggests, but also, as our eighth principle proposes, on accountably dismantling in ourselves and in our institution racism. Thank you.
I'm here to bring it home to our particular congregation, our history as context for adopting the new eighth principle. As our congregation adopts the eighth principle, our ongoing work will include honest self-examination, both individually and as a congregation. Looking back at our history, UUs, Unitarian Universalists, had done some things right. UUs even have had a national and local reputation for helping dismantle racism. This is why we need especially to live up to our own standards now. Like all organizations and institutions in this country, our denomination and our congregation have much work to do to dismantle racism. I think we all understand that in doing anti-racism work going forward, we are warned not to rest on our past accomplishments and not to self-congratulate. That would be like a white person saying, I can't be racist because my best friend is black. Or for someone to say, you can't tell me anything about racism because I marched with Dr. King in the 1960s. So, with humility, we review our past. To prepare for this morning's service, I touched base with some longtime members to refresh my memory on the social justice work within this congregation. Ray Baumel, the oldest member of UU Miami, told me we actually did march in 1965 in Selma along with Reverend Dr. King. That is, our minister and congregational president were there, along with UUs from elsewhere, including UU Pastor James Reeb, who sadly was murdered by white supremacists the next day. Carol Ryder told me that she and her husband Jeff helped desegregate South Miami by going to court against block-busting realtors. Carol started an integrated Girl Scout brownie troop on this campus. This congregation had the first integrated nursery school in the area, and Lynn Baumel taught music there. Janice MacArthur's mom, Gertrude Pearl, did ongoing work for rights and peace and just about every progressive cause. Judy Homer's mom, Irene Stauber, was very engaged in worker rights and stood with labor and civil rights leader Cesar Chavez. And there are so many more stories where this came from, and I'm sure you'd like to hear them. And I am proposing that one of our first activities as an Eighth Principle congregation would be to have a panel, or at least one panel, of people from the past telling us about our legacy. Yes, we today are standing on some dedicated and sincere people's work. We are not starting from scratch. We are not alone as we grapple with racism and other oppressions in our society and in ourselves. Through self-examination and knowing who we are, we can go deeper into dismantling racism with strength, honesty, humility, and openness. Thank you.
I guess I want to start with thanking the members of our Social Justice Committee who spoke with you this morning. You know, each person in their own hearts finds their own reason for working on anti-racism and the various anti-oppression work that we do as a community. And I thought it was so important for you to hear from each of them about their experiences, whether that be from the Decentering Whiteness Book Club or some of the work that's been done in this community. You know, each of us has our own reasons, and I guess I would ask you to think about, as I talk today, what your reason might be to work on anti-racism, both internally and as a community. I need to give you a little bit of history, or a little bit of information, maybe that's a better way to say this. Each Unitarian Universalist congregation, like UU Miami, is an independent community. We decide as a community how to worship, how to govern ourselves, what values we hold as a community. And each of these independent communities comprise our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association, or the UUA as we call it. And collectively we decide on which social justice causes we'll give attention to as a denomination. They also do other things for us, help develop curricula, help vet ministers, those kind of things. And we as a denomination of all these independent congregations decide how we will describe ourselves as Unitarian Universalists. There's a bylaw in the Unitarian Universalist Association that describes who we are and what values we hold. For some, it's the principle statement. For others, it's called the 7 Principles. You heard about the 7 Principles a little earlier today. I thought it might be useful for us to remember them and to speak about them and see how they resonate with us right now. So here are the 7 principles, or at least a few of them. What I'd like for us to do, if I'd invite you to do with me, is to read them, and again, to see how they resonate with you. So here's how they start. We affirm and promote, and you read with me, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. As you say these, I wonder how they feel. Do they describe to you who it is to be a Unitarian Universalist? You know, you may see these principles around campus at times. They're certainly talked about from the pulpit. They're discussed in our children's religious education program. But I will tell you this. These principles that we just said are prescriptive. They're designed to be descriptive. They're designed to be descriptive, to describe who we are as Unitarian Universalists. They're not prescriptive. And what I mean by that is they're not a creed. You know, but many Unitarian Universalists feel that these statements ground us as a community. And some people say they're what holds us together as a community. These values hold us together as a community. They're what we turn to and think about as we make decisions as a community. As we decide what work to do for social justice in the community, we think about these principles. And some people say that these 7 principles are enough. That this proposed 8th principle is not needed because it's already implied in our 7 principles. That may be true, but I want us to think about this. When we set our priorities, when we decide who we are as individuals and as a community, a congregation, do we need an 8th principle? So I'd like us to say the 8th principle and see how that feels to you as you say it. We affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So how does that feel? Do you resonate with that? What would it be like if this congregation were to embody that principle in our own lives and as a community and in this larger community of Miami and Miami-Dade, and work that we do in the world, where we allocate our resources, how we make our choices. At our congregational meeting in May, you, the members of this congregation, will be asked to vote on whether this statement should be added to the UU Miami bylaws. And if you answer yes, this principle will give direction to your church leaders and begin to shape who we are as a congregation. Now, some of you may say, and you heard this from Carol, that we're already doing some of this work. We have this Decentering Whiteness Book Club and our Indigenous Study Group, and we're welcoming congregations to the LGBTQ community. We have a Black Lives Matter sign here and outside on our property, and an LGBTQ plus banner here and outside. And of course, we've done work on anti-racism and anti-oppression, and we're known for that in the community. And I'd say, again, all that is correct. But I would also tell you a couple of things. That Unitarian Universalist congregations across the country are adopting this principle for a reason. And the Unitarian Universalist Association itself, all of our congregations are going to be considering this principle at a future denominational meeting for a reason. But just because other congregations are doing it and just because our denomination might be doing it doesn't mean that we have to. And so I ask you, why should we? You've heard from some of the members of our Social Justice Committee They felt that this principle was so important that they took it to the board to ask them to have you vote on it in May. And as you've heard, it's more than just walking in civil rights marches. It's more than signing petitions. It's also the work we do inside ourselves as we learn how living in a white supremacy culture affects all of us and has since we were born. And what we internally, in our own behavior, in our own lives, might need to do to change and to be vulnerable and ready to do that kind of work. And so what we're deciding to do as a community is to hold some small group meetings where people can openly discuss this principle. This will happen in the coming weeks before our denominational meeting. And we'll give you an opportunity to share your thoughts. Why do we do that? Because as Unitarian Universalists, we vote our conscience, and we use the democratic process. And we want you to be informed and contextual voters. We want to hear your thoughts and feelings, and for you to hear the thoughts and feelings of others in this community. In a judgment-free zone where we treat each other with compassion and respect as we share our viewpoints openly. The Social Justice Committee is going to be in these groups as well. We want you to be able to voice your thoughts and feelings because your voice matters. And we believe that this principle matters, that it can guide us as a community into the future. I've been doing some reading and thinking about all this, and so I want to share some thoughts with you. They're kind of random, but I want to share them with you anyway. And they were sparked by an article that I read, or some notes that I read from Carol when she took them at a meeting about the eighth principle. And the talk was given by Unitarian Universalist Paula Cole-Jones, who founded ADORE. ADORE is a dialogue on race and ethnicity. So let me share some of these, I guess you could say, random thoughts, because I want you to think about them, to feel about them, to see what stirs within you so that you can voice your thoughts and feelings with each other. As we have lived in this world and in this country, we know that we have done work on anti-racism and anti-oppression. But my friends, the reality is we have just scratched the surface. There is so much more work to be done, both as individuals, as a community, and in our larger community. So as you think about this principle, whether you would choose to vote on it or not, this principle could be for us a call to action, to do more, to dig deeper, to look more clearly at ourselves and the world. Perhaps for some it would be motivation. Perhaps for some it would be a theological statement, living our faith. As I look at this statement, I don't feel that the 7 principles explicitly affirms and promotes anti-racism and anti-oppression. And I need an explicit statement to remind me to keep doing this work, so that it's in the front of my mind, so I can see it in front of me when I look in the sanctuary. If we put it up in here, as we look at our bylaws, as we talk to each other, it's an explicit statement that we put in front of ourselves as we do the work of the world, as we build our community, as we build our connections with each other. I know some of you may be unsure that this is the way to go. Some of you may want to go, very much want this to happen. And some of you may not want this at all. But the only way we're going to find all that out is if we are together, and we discern together how to move forward. There are always people in our denomination, and most probably in this congregation, who are going to say that this is an urgent call to us to do this work, to be overtly, explicitly anti-racist and anti-oppressive. We can't, they might say, waste any more time. People are being harmed, and we can't let down another generation of children. When you hear that from one of your peers here in the congregation, this urgency within them, how will you respond? Because, my friends, I know that I will be saying it. With this principle, we can begin to make every effort to see our lives in this congregation through a sharper lens of anti-racism and anti-oppression. Accepting this principle, I believe, is a work of love. And as we know, the work of love is not always easy or comfortable. It could mean being vulnerable and making mistakes. But that's how love is. Really deep, connected love. And it's worth the work. It's worth the vulnerability. It's worth making mistakes. My friends, I say to you, let us not turn away from this principle. Let us really take it in and think about it and feel about it and talk about it. And then to engage in the work that this principle calls us toward.